Welcome classic rock fans to another one of my Patreon videos, my exclusive classic album review video for June in fact. And today I want to be talking about an album that has made a considerable impression upon me, and that is Big Big Train's Folklore. This album is haunting, it's breathtaking, it's enchanting, and there's a whole lot of adjectives I could throw at it. Magnificent, there's another one. It's an album that's really resonated with me, and it's hardly surprising really that I love this album so much, considering the brilliance of their back catalogue, English Electric Parts 1 and 2 for example. I certainly love bands that keep that progressive flame ablaze in many respects. And another band you may not have heard of is Magenta. Their album 7 is also an album that's drawn straight from the paradigms established by bands like Yes and Genesis and King Crimson in the 1970s. And there are moments on this album that are absolutely staggering, of course. It is an album of contrasts, of course, and different sort of fluxes in mood and instrumentation. I particularly like how the heavier sections are put side by side, juxtaposed with moments of considered beauty and quiet reflection. As I've said, this band very much carries the torch of that classic 70s prog. If I had an interesting comparison to make, is this album with, say, the Genesis album Selling England by the Pound. I think the difference being, of course, whereas Selling England by the Pound is one that looks at the idea or the vision of old England or the myth surrounding old England, whereas this album looks at folklore and myth and how it is a constant evolving narrative and informs our lives today as much as it ever has done. And if we're talking about sort of 70s prog, of course, this band are very much like King Crimson are a sum of its parts. I mean, there are 8 members in total, I believe, that contribute beautifully to the magnus opus that is this record. And it's now, of course, defined by elaborate instrumentation and beautiful musical passages and storytelling, of course, which is very much the nub of this record. All about sort of myth and fantasy and folklore. Not so much fantasy, I think folklore, and how that is the very lifeblood and spring of our existences. Interestingly, Greg Sporton says that this album is not a concept album, but merely a collection of curated tales, which is fascinating. It's a fascinating analogy to make. It reminds me a little bit of Nick Cave's Murder Ballads, the same sort of thing. These little narratives explored in each individual song, contributing to the overall arc or theme of the record. But in many respects this feels like a critique of folklore rather than just pure folklore in itself. For example, it's a study of the very human trait of needing to develop myth as opposed to myths themselves. But these are not just tales that deal with a fantasy or fantastical topography. They're very much stories that are rooted in our modern consciousness. I mean, the wonderful story about the World War II carrier pigeon, for example, they're very much about the modern world. They're not just rooted in ancient lore. I suppose ultimately the message from this album comes from the idea that it speaks of the very nature of legend, and and the dynamic is in the retelling of these stories and the reappropriating of these stories that are just passed on from generation to generation. I think that's a point that's established in the actual title track itself. Of course, I'm not saying that there aren't magical elements on this record, rather than these are folklores and myths that are a testimony to the human spirit rather than purely supernatural. For example, the music is as well. It's triumphant, especially again the wonderful title track. It's music that is balladic, it's progressive, where myth and storytelling is melded seamlessly with the very notion of English history. If we think about the title track very much feels like a kind of an oral overture. It very much sets the tone for the record. It's as a kind of a litany of little tales and snippets that we come to expect. And the very idea that these tales are passed down, they're passed on, is the important message of this album. We get the idea of these stories being shared around a campfire. It's a lovely metaphor, really. And each track promises so much. We're introduced to each track and it kind of promises so much from the get-go. It's a string-led, brass-infused affair that has almost a triumphant feel to it. A celebratory nature of the very idea of folklore and what it contributes to English identity. One commentator said that this record is this song is a kind of a Celtic flavoured funk that's very much sets the storyteller's scene, and certainly its Irish influence, flute and rhythm, sets the platform for what is about to unfold, for the turning of the next page, so to speak. And the central conceit, the central idea of this song is a storyteller, of course, which is the very centre of this album. You know, it refers to a storyteller who's one who's passed it down to the young from the old. We feel it deep down in our soul. Absolutely beautiful lyric. You know, it's very much like the wonderful old folk ballads told by Steel Eye Span and Fairport Convention, but it moves away from those sort of folk paradigms to being far more progressive and, in my opinion, far more entertaining listen. Rather than the bearded fellows with their fingers in their ears and the violins and mandolins, instead we get, you know, some nice Eno-esque flourishes on the keyboard and stuff like that. It certainly keeps the listener intrigued, you know, from the moment from the opening lines of this number. I love the strings, of course, at the start of this one. It's incredibly atmospheric. We get a lovely jangly piano bit as well, which I enjoy. That's before it goes all clannad on us. But I think obviously the central idea is that tales and folklore is the nation's lifeblood, and I love the refrain, it carries on. It's a beautiful refrain sung beautifully, of course. And the guitar tone as well, the guitar soloing is remarkable, and it has a tonal quality that reminds me a little bit of Mike Oldfield. London Plain is perhaps one of my favourite songs on the album, as it tells the story of a tree that is growing at the side of the Thames. And it's a wonderful platform from which to view the changing topography of the landscape, the idea that this folklore, some things are enduring, time passes, lives end, but this is enduring, folklore is enduring. And, you know, the slow melody as well gives the impression of something developing and emerging, something growing, which is quite important, I think. And of course this tree gets to see the evolving of a city from its vantage point of the Strand, where it witnesses the Great Fire, but also, you know, Turner paints his impressionistic flurries of mist-covered Thames. That's, of course, before the modern city springs up like snowdrops in a modern symphony of metal and glass. It's a wonderful image of time passing, and time passing to enforce the idea that some things endure. The whole song moves from a mysterious ballad to more sort of up-tempo, to have a more up-tempo feel, before sinking back into the gentle ambience that very much reflects the character of the river that flows through this song. Along the Ridgeway, of course, employs this absolutely stunning topography and evokes many iconic images of the English countryside, the White Horse, of course, and the Salisbury Giant, which I think the song segues into the Salisbury Giant, but also refers to the Blowing Stone, which is referenced in Tom Brown's School Days, a book that takes me back to my own school days. Of course, the Blowing Stone is associated with King Alfred, who would use it to summon his armies, I believe. That's when he wasn't burning the cakes, of course. Beautiful instrumentation on this one, some lovely jazz prog flourishes. The violin and the atmospheric Hammond provided by Danny Manners all contribute to the beautiful tapestry that is the song. It beautifully evokes the English countryside, a myth. George slays the dragon, of course, and the chalk horse animates and canters towards the lumbering Salisbury Giant. And I love the way when we get into the song The Salisbury Giant, how it has a kind of a ponderous thud to it. Certainly through the use of metaphorical instrumentation here, we get that image of this behemoth trudging across the Berkshire Downs. Transit of Venus Across the Sun is another wonderful song, and it refers to quite a lot to Patrick Moore. Patrick Moore is another figure from my childhood. You can see why this album resonated so much with me. One reviewer has said that that the Latin chanted backing vocals conjure up Big Big Train's very own Major Tom, which is certainly an interesting reference really to make, considering that it does refer to, I believe it's dedicated to the astronomer, as I've said, Patrick Moore. But this time the journey is an earthly one rather than stratospheric, so to speak, but nevertheless it deals with isolation just as poignantly. The vocals, of course, are exquisite on this number, and it allows us to plot a course for the stars, to quote the song, and the protagonist never meaning to return. It's it's an interesting idea of sort of exploration in that respect. Interestingly, Sir Patrick Moore died in 2012, and I'm sure he's up there somewhere still playing his xylophone. Wassail is another interesting one. It's a great song that was actually featured on the band's EP. It was brought over for this album. Wassail is actually a glass of mulled cider. So we seem to be fairly rooted in that part of England, that West Country, Gloucester, Salisbury, Berkshire area, especially with the idea of cider anyway. And the instrumentation of this song it contributes to the overall fun of it, from the flute trills to the mandolin to the violin, which beautifully complements a bend at the elbow, not to play the violin but to lift a wonderful glass of cider. It's a wonderful song that celebrates that English apple harvest tradition. We get the tale of Winky, of course, which tells the story of a carrier pigeon that saves the lives of a stranded bomber crew by getting a message to HQ. It's a true story. The instrumentation is wonderful on this, fluctuating from quite heavier passages. It's divided into 7 sections, I think, very much in tradition of those wonderful sort of 1970s Yes opuses. But the pigeon actually saves the lives of these men, but it's the music that is really important on this. It fluctuates from the cinematic to the contemplative to euphoric, imbuing the whole song with a sense of suspense and drama. Interesting aside, of course, Winky went on to win the Dickin Medal for playing a vital role in the rescue of the aircrew who crash-landed in the North Sea in 1944 during World War II. Brooklands is also another epic track on this, so it's a long number celebrating the achievements of racing driver John Cobb, who dies in 1952 while trying to break the world water speed record on Loch Ness. And this time travelling between this young man's desire to drive and break records on the motor circuit and his older self wishing for one last time as he races towards a fading light. Of course, the fading light is so poignant on so many levels. It's quite an effective metaphor in that respect. But it's wistful, it's romantic, but it's also imbued with pain and pathos. This song, of course, is dedicated very much to the racing car itself, which was the Napier Railton race car, which shattered the world speed records at Brooklands in the 1930s. But interestingly, it's what they do with the musical passages that's important here. It races through some double time segments with aggressive guitar leads before culminating in some quite gentle, reflective interludes. The whole thing is wrapped up with the final song, which is Telling the Bees. It's a tradition of confiding very important information to our little furry garden visitors. Of course, it has a warm pastoral feel, as we would expect from a song with this title, and that the feel is it has kind of an organic instrumentation. I don't know if that makes sense, but it beautifully is befitting with the song's subject matter. The song evokes a very sweet, innocent, youthful tone that it really does feel like we're taken back on a journey through time with this number, with this album in total, but not without losing sight of where we are now, which is what's important to remember about this album. But it's a statement about life, death, love and freedom, of course, and the quintessential elements of myth that are presented to be beautifully fragile. And fragile, something needs to be celebrated, which is effectively what this record does. This album is a perfect gift for anyone who enjoys quality progressive music, progressive rock music. It's you get these yarns that create a collective air of wonder and magnificence. I'm so grateful that this record was suggested that I do a Patron review of this one. The instrumentation is stunning. The vocal work it needs to be mentioned as well. The vocals are absolutely beautiful, incredible on this album. Standout tracks for me are, as I've said, if I look at A London Plane, I think is my favourite. I mean, I like them all. There isn't, listening to this album, it's just a very immersive experience, and I didn't find there was anything on there that I wished wasn't on there. I would highly, highly recommend giving this album a listen to. Anyway, you've been listening to one of my exclusive Patreon classic album reviews. I thank you for your continued support, and hopefully I'll look forward to seeing you next month.